Coherentism. Coherence theories claim that truth resides in the absolute system of knowledge. Much like foundationalism, there's a classic version and then a non-classic version. So the classic coherentists, those embracing classic coherentism, take the view that truth is not defined in terms of correspondence of propositions, claims, with facts. And the correspondence theory of truth is kind of our intuitive view of how truth works. That when we say something, if it matches reality, whatever that means, then it's true. If it doesn't match reality, it's false. So the coherentists reject that. They claim that truth is defined in terms of integrated and absolute wholes, in which individual propositions receive justification and what they like to call relative truth credentials. So every true belief is entailed by every other proposition in a coherent system. Roughly put, and the reason why I have the picture of the space station there is this. The idea is that unlike the foundationalist who holds that you have a solid foundation that you build up from, for coherentism, the basic idea is that it's how all the pieces fit together. In space, of course, out of the gravity well of a planet, you have nothing to build on. So the way you build is you connect all the pieces together and you get a coherent structure by all the pieces being held, bolted together. So for classic coherentism, the idea is that all these things fit together. They justify each other. Now, in the late 20th, early 21st century, there were coherentists such as Quine, Wilfrid Sellars, Gilbert Harman, Keith Lehrer, and Lawrence Bonjour, who rejected this coherence theory of truth. Why? They regarded it as an implausible metaphysical doctrine, so bad metaphysics. So what they accepted instead was not a coherence theory of truth, but what may not seem that different to most people, but absolutely critical to them. They accepted a coherentist theory of justification. So the idea is that individual beliefs get justified by the entire system of beliefs in which they cohere. And on their view, all justification is inferential. So justification requires steps. And so the notion of being properly basic, that is, just being justified, would be a contradiction, because justification requires inference steps. Properly basic beliefs are supposedly justified just, on their own, no steps required. And so they reject that notion. Now, the way to sort of think of this and make it seem plausible is think of, for example, a typical, say, murder mystery or detective show or one of those courtroom drama shows where they're trying to solve the crime or figure out who's guilty and innocent. And typically, if you have like a whole movie or an episode, it's not just like one thing that comes up and just dramatically does it, although they're dramatic ones. The idea is that each piece, in the case, all fit together to try to justify the claim of guilt or innocence. So, for example, if it's a murder investigation, there'd be like one bit it would be like the weapon, another would be like the alibi or lack thereof, then be motivation, other bits of evidence like maybe film evidence, testimonies, etc. And all these would cohere together to justify each other, but also justify the claim of guilt or innocence. And it kind of does make sense, because that's sort of how people, at least on television and movies, how they do that detective stuff. So the obvious question then is, if coherentism is appealing, why at this point am I not saying, well, coherentism saved it all, solved the problem, we know stuff, thank you coherentism, problem solved? Well, here's why. What's considered to be the fatal objection against coherentism is what's called the Isolation Objection. And here's the problem. The coherence of a theory or set of belief doesn't seem to be enough to justify it. Why not? Well, it doesn't provide the necessary standards to distinguish between illusory but consistent theories or sets of beliefs. Fairy tales, dreams, hallucinations, fictional stories may be very coherent. Imagine, well-written fantasy worlds, like in movies or science fiction worlds, that cohere very well. But those, are not true. Astrology might be as coherent as astronomy. Now, these are all, kind of abstract and theoretical, but we can look at a real-world example. And somewhat ironically, the best counterexample to coherentism occurred before coherentism, in late 20th, early 21st century was a thing. And it occurred during World War II. And maybe wondering, what's the picture of those super strong guys lifting that tank? Well, the tank is inflatable. And the reason why is this. During World War II, of course, the Allied powers were planning an invasion of Europe to retake it from the Nazis. And the defenders, the Germans, knew that the Allies were going to have to, attack across the channel. And so that was not a mystery. But there's a lot of coast. And if they could find out where the Allies would land, that would give them, considerable advantage because they could focus their forces there. So what the Allies wanted to do was make sure that the Germans, the Nazis, their opponents at the time, did not know where they were going. And what they did is, without going into the long historical details, but they created fake, military forces. For example, the inflatable tank. They created like false divisions, and they would set up these inflatable vehicles, inflatable planes, to make it look like there were forces there. And they would have people who would do all this radio chatter to make it seem like there were forces there. And they, of course, would spread, stories and rumors and stuff to make it appear like there really were those divisions and forces existed. One of the most extreme ones was they actually took a dead person, a corpse, dressed them up like a British officer, handcuffed a briefcase full of supposed secrets to this person, and to make it seem plausible, they put all the little things that people accumulate in their life. For example, in the person's, say, wallet, there'd be a few ticket stubs, business cards, etc. And there was even in his coat pocket, apparently, a letter from his bank claiming he had been overdrafted, to make it seem realistic. And his body was dumped off a ship. It drifted up near Spain, and Spain was not formally fighting the Allies, but was friendly to Nazi Germany. And so, of course, when they found the secret briefcase, they shared the plans with the Germans. And so, because of all this fakery and trickery, creating a very coherent seeming plan to invade at a particular place, the Germans believed that this was true. So you had a perfectly coherent fake, invasion plan that all cohered. Everything checked against everything else. And on the coherent theory of, justification, it would seem the Germans would know. But since they lost, clearly they did not know. And so, somewhat ironically, before coherentism even became fully developed, it already had a perfect counterexample against it. Now, we also, continuing along with some of the objections, we generally want to connect our theories and beliefs with empirical data, rather than just having them, cohere against each other. Now, in the favor of coherentism, consistency does seem to be a necessary condition for justification. That's to say, if beliefs are not consistent with each other, then those beliefs would not be justified. But it doesn't seem to be a sufficient condition. So being consistent, a set of beliefs, does not, seem to be adequate to establish justification. But if beliefs were, justified, then they would have to be consistent. So if beliefs are justified, then they're consistent, but it doesn't follow that because beliefs are consistent that they're justified. Now this rests on the philosophical critical thinking concepts of necessary and sufficient. And briefly, here are those. If one thing is necessary for another, let's say A is necessary for B, that means that A is required for B. But this does not mean that A must be sufficient for B. And A is sufficient for B means if A is the case, then so is B. But A need not be necessary for B. To use an example, think of like requirements for classes. So suppose in order to take, the second English class, you have to take the first one. That would mean that English 1 is necessary for taking English 2. But it need not be sufficient because you could take English 1 and never take English 2. Now, if something's sufficient, that means that it gets you the, what it's sufficient for, but it need not be necessary for it. So, for example, getting a C is sufficient to pass the class, but it need not be necessary for it, because a person could obviously pass without a C. They could have a B or an A. So that takes us to the end of our brief adventure in epistemology. And we end up essentially, kind of with the skeptic sort of winning, because we never end up beating the skeptic. But if you want to see more of epistemology, there is, of course, the epistemology class. And now we'll turn to looking at metaphysics.